It's really a pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to speak to you with, I think, a somewhat different set of perspectives on NGO board service, largely because I think my experiences are somewhat different from most of the people in the room. First, I come from the United States, excuse me, where the legal and regulatory regimes are somewhat different. But perhaps more important, I think, even the social context of NGOs and their relationship to government and the role of philanthropy also differ. In addition, I'm an academic economist, and I have spent most of my career not focused on research about social sector, but thinking through issues about corporate strategy, corporate finance, and governance of traditional for-profit organizations. And finally, my engagement with NGOs reaches sort of a diverse set of domains that extend beyond social services, as I tend to work with innovative organizations founded by students and alumni of our programs, and it's usually the innovation and the students themselves that draw me to the particular organization rather than the domain. So for that, I want to apologize. The examples I will draw upon today are from outside the domain of traditional social services, but I think the lessons apply broadly. I think one of the reasons I was asked to speak today is that I am one of the faculty directors of the Rustandy Center for Social Sector Innovation at Chicago Booth. We have been fortunate to have received a grant from the Hong Kong Jockey Club to administer a robust set of programs around social innovation in Hong Kong. This program has just recently been launched, and we look forward to working with many of you here as we seek to provide complementary programs and research to strengthen innovative social sector institutions in Hong Kong. The University of Chicago, as some of you may know, will be opening a magnificent center on Mount Davis later this year, relocating from our temporary facility in Cyberport, which houses our Asian Executive MBA program. I do want to mention one thing, one little advertisement, which is that as part of the Jockey Club program on social innovation, there are full scholarships for a number of NGO leaders or future leaders. So if you or someone in your organization is interested, please find me, one of my colleagues, or our website. It really is a great opportunity. We are very firm believers that the skill sets that we teach in the MBA programs can be incredibly useful for individuals and for the organizations in which they work. So hopefully we'll find a match. So I'm going to focus my talk on strategy and governance of NGOs. And it's hard to define strategy exactly, but I think the easiest way to think about it is big decisions. Decisions of what it is we're going to do, what it is we're not going to do, how are we going to create value in the community, and what are the specific mechanisms for doing that. And if we think about boards and their traditional roles, obviously there's financial oversight, legal compliance, fundraising, overseeing the senior management of the organization. But with respect to strategic decision making, there tends to be a fair amount of variation in the role that the NGO board plays. Some of those important strategic decisions that the board may get deeply involved in or may get less involved in include things like capital projects, right? And for most NGOs, capital projects usually involve buildings of some kind. But also strategic decisions, the choices of what programs we're going to choose to do, how we're going to respond to changes in the marketplace and in the environment are also critical strategic decisions. So program choices, shifting beneficiaries for your programs, the choice of the geographic scope of the organization and the services you provide, the scale, and just the underlying business model. So a big question I know that comes up a lot these days is, should we develop a social enterprise, and what role should that play in our organization? So all of those are the types of decisions I'm thinking about when we're thinking about strategic decision making. Well, it's really hard for NGO boards compared to traditional boards. If you think about a traditional for-profit organization, the first thing that makes your life easy is that there's a common view as to what the underlying objective is, which is some notion of value or profit maximization. Second, your role as a board member in the organization is clear. You have very specific fiduciary duties and fiduciary duties with respect to that objective of the organization. In addition, the board and senior management share a great deal of expertise and common language and common experiences. So management has expertise over things like strategic decision making. It's part of why they rise up and are successful in the organization. And they understand the financial aspects of the key decisions they have to make. And that tends to be true of board members as well, right? The board members, a large fraction, come with that type of experience and industry or related industry knowledge. So you start from a situation where there's a great deal of commonality to oversee these types of decisions. In NGOs, it can be quite different. First of all, objectives may be unclear, right? So the mission of the organization may not be completely worked out, and the strategy, the way in which the organization plans to achieve its mission as well may be unclear. So opportunities or threats have to be evaluated in the context of somewhat ambiguous objectives, and not always deep knowledge among everybody involved of the financial realities. And there's no equivalence to fiduciary duty. No clear. So what it is that you need to be, as a board member, you need to be focusing on and viewing as your objective may not always be clear. I want to talk a little bit about some of these with an example. This is a case study that I often teach. It is a really uninteresting organization. This is an organization, and it's also old. It's called the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, it's in Philadelphia. Thing to note is I'm not going to go into lots of details, but what the Historical Society of Pennsylvania is it's sort of a multifaceted organization. It has a research library, has an artifact collection, so people contribute historical artifacts that have been in the family to their collection. They have exhibits, and they have a physical location in downtown Philadelphia which acts as both a place for the exhibits and a club of sorts for its members. Okay? So this organization expanded from its sort of traditional sets of activities into some education programs with school. There wasn't a great deal of financial discipline, either within management that didn't really have financial expertise or within the board that was somewhat disengaged. So they started spending for their programs out of their endowment, and all of a sudden they came to the realization that they were in financial trouble. Not a terribly unusual story, unfortunately. So what happens? They bring in a new executive director, and it takes time. Right, because the new executive director has to understand what are actually the cost structure of our different programs. How does this work? How are we going to, we don't even have the knowledge base and the understanding of our organization in order to make effective decisions. So that takes a year or two, and during that time, it becomes clear that they're going to have to make some hard decisions. Right, and they're probably going to have to give up some of the activities that they do. So that means, because the board consisted of many people, some of whom cared about one aspect of the organization and others who cared about the other, that there was going to be tension in the board. So what did the chairman of the board do? He quit. Right, which is also sometimes, not uncommon. And as I think actually that lays one of the biggest, what I think is one of the biggest lessons that I want to convey, which is if you're on a board, you should know that you're signing up for the good and bad, and you should be committed to being engaged with the organization, not only when things are going well. So I ask my students, okay, how do you figure out what you're going to do? Which of these programs should you give up? And I say, let's say what you care about is the artifact collection because, your family, your grandparents, and your great-grandparents contributed to the artifact collection. So that's what really is what you care about as a board member. What role should that play in your decision-making for the organization? And the first thing most people say, my students say, is, well, it really shouldn't be the thing that drives it. So I say, okay, what is it? What's your obligation to? And everyone says it's to the mission of the organization. Right? And I let people talk about it for a while, and they come to a consensus. Yes, your duty is to the mission. I said, okay, let's look at the mission statement. I'm not going to put it up for you, but it's not going to help. The reason why the mission statement is not going to help is because it talks about everything the organization does, and it's all part of the mission. It doesn't say this is more important than that, or it doesn't say how each of the 4 or 5 sets of programs fit into a single fundamental objective, and therefore allows you to create priorities. So it really is a challenge. I don't really know as a board member whether it would be appropriate or inappropriate in this sort of situation to vote for the artifacts collection if that's what you care about, right? And that creates sort of this fundamental tension where the absence of a clear mission statement and a clear agreement about priorities within the board can create real problems. So thinking about that, getting board members to make sure they understand what it is that the organization's trying to achieve and what their role ought to be for key decisions that the organization has to make. I want to talk about one other example. This is not a case study. There's very little kind of systematic academic research around NGO governance and issues. But I was involved in a large study which sort of looked at over basically a 15-year period all of the major building projects of a set of arts types of organizations in the United States. So museums, performing arts centers, and theaters. So either new facilities or substantial expansions of existing facilities. So we looked at all major projects, got the kind of basic financial details of that. We did detailed interviews of decision makers, around 50 projects, 11 in-depth field studies, and we published 4 case studies for teaching. So there was a lot of failure, which made it interesting. Lots of these projects, by anybody's definition, were not successful. And I think one of the real lessons from that is that if you look for the reasons why these projects failed, board governance was a big part of it, lack of effective board governance. The main reason why, the main kind of symptom of failure is you extend your resources to build a new facility without, one, really deeply understanding the market demand for that, and secondly, and most importantly, not understanding and being prepared for the operating expenses of managing the building when it comes. So the typical story goes, we plan to build a new theater. We really had to, then we hired a star architect, and our initial expectations of what it was going to cost doubled. We twisted arms of everybody who's a supporter or donor that we could in order to fund the building. And we managed to pull it off. And then all of a sudden we realized that, we weren't going to generate enough revenue to cover the costs, and our donor base was tapped out and was unable to provide more funding. We have these great pictures of museums, new museums, which has on the door, Sunday closed, Monday closed, Tuesday closed, Wednesday closed, Thursday, 12 to 6 p.m., Friday, 12 to 6 p.m., Saturday closed, something like that. Brand new buildings. So what we learned from that is engaged financial expertise on the board is essential. And the key word here is engaged. What we saw very often in the study is there were financial experts on the board. They just weren't engaged, and they weren't paying close enough attention. And the executive directors and the senior management and the artistic teams, they felt good because, hey, we've got these financial whizzes on the board. We don't need to, if they say okay, we're good. And nobody was really watching closely and doing the deep work. So the other part of that is there really needs to be a partnership, therefore. And it was great to hear Fanny talked about this, I think, as being clear, between the senior management of the organization, the artistic directors, and the board to be realistic about the programming mission. So the basic idea here is that lots of these projects get started, get going because they have this, if we build it, they will come, but that's really dangerous and unrealistic. And again, the board has to play a fundamental role. These are many great organizations ended up failing because of engaging in too big a project that that ended up ruining the organization. So what can we learn from some of these things? Before I get to these, I want to say one other thing just broadly about thinking about governance. The way you should think about governance is not day-to-day. Sort of any sort of, governance always works if it's business as usual in the organization. So it doesn't matter so much, right? Governance, both in the traditional for-profit sector and in the NGO sector, is what if something unexpected happens? That often is bad news, some kind of crisis, but it's also opportunities. It's opportunities, technology comes along, the government becomes interested in funding expansion for the type of work you're doing, whatever, but something that's a fundamental change. And what you need to do is ask yourself, do we have a board structure and a governance structure in place that can actually lead to effective decision-making if something that we don't expect to happen actually happens? Okay. So here's some ideas. One is think about your mission statement not to be a political statement that makes everybody happy, but actually something that's going to be a guide to tough decisions about where the organization could go when there are threats or opportunities. And then underneath that mission statement, that's when you can list all the programs and make everybody happy. But those need to be flexible and be able to change as those opportunities change. Thinking carefully and talking to board members and having board members talk to each other about the relationship between personal objectives and serving the organization and its mission seems to be important as well. And then I think first and foremost is you need this commitment of the board to be prepared to engage deeply when major strategic issues arise. One is, the time and the willingness to take the time, the energy, and the effort to make it happen, but also, and more importantly, to understand the issues and to work closely enough with the management team in the organization so that they would be prepared to play that role when it becomes necessary, even, so that it doesn't take 2 years of analysis and or the chairman quitting before you can, as an organization, effectively deal with some unexpected situation. So with that, I hope those things are useful, and I look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much.